Okay, we are very happy to be here in this second session of the seminar that we have between the Mexican Economic History Association and the Mexican Economic History Association of the Northern States of Mexico. We have been working in this project for the last year, and we want to continue with it. It has been a great effort. And today we're going to talk about interdisciplinary topics. We're going to talk about economic history and business history, but in terms of its interdisciplinary development. And for this purpose, we have three rock stars, three great academics, which will be more detailedly introduced by my colleague, Diana Mendez, Steffi Decker, Aldo Musacchio, and Bernardo Batis. And well, we're very happy to be here. We're going to continue with this effort and to have another session, the first session in June, in mid 2023. So we hope that you see us and we continue with this. So I'm going to pass the floor to my colleague, Diana Mendez. Thank you very much for being here. And
junto con la Asociación de Historia Económica del Norte de México, de la cual soy secretaria ejecutiva, este ejercicio de diálogo, de reflexión en voz alta sobre temas que les son comunes o que son puntos actuales en la discusión dentro de la historia económica y empresarial. En esta segunda sesión organizada y al cual agradecemos la colaboración, el esfuerzo y las gestiones de la doctora Araceli Almaraz, secretaria de la Asociación Mexicana de Historia Económica, y junto con su presidente, para tener un panel de lujo, como ya bien dijo el doctor Galindo, con académicos y académicas de universidades extranjeras, quienes se suman a este diálogo. Por un lado, Stephanie Decker de la Universidad de Birmingham, Aldo Musacchio de Brandeis University y Bernardo Batis Lazo de la Universidad Anáhuac y Northern University. Es un gusto, un placer escucharlos esta mañana, tardes en otras latitudes del mundo, en este diálogo que seguro será muy fructífero y enriquecedor y que, bueno, espero sea la antesala para continuar con este esfuerzo en el 2023. Sin más preámbulo, les cedo la palabra a a Bernardo, quien iniciará esas preguntas, el diálogo y la reflexión a partir de preguntas que Araceli Almaraz les ha planteado. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Diana. We are very excited for this virtual session to discuss about three questions. Thank you for stay with us. Thank you to el Colegio de la Frontera Norte, el Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas de la Universidad Autónoma de Baja California and Universidad Veracruzana, and my college, el Colegio de la Frontera Norte, for this session. We start with Steffi, next Bernardo, and finish with the Aldo intervention. We have 8 minutes for each question. And my first question for all of you is, what is your opinion about the economic history and interdiscipline and business, thinking in your work, in your own work, and the international debates? Please, Steffi, welcome. And we are right now expecting listen to you.
Thank you, Araceli. And my apologies, my Spanish is not really good enough to have an intellectual conversation, but I could follow quite a lot of what was previously said. So I'm really pleased to be part of this event. Thank you so much for inviting me. The first question Araceli posed is around both international and interdisciplinary research for economic and business history. So from my perspective, focusing mostly on business history, I think interdisciplinary research is effectively what defines our field. I think it is maybe too limited to think of ourselves as a separate field. I think we really are an interdiscipline, and that a lot of the intellectual impulses have always come in our research from this space that we inhabit at the intersection of different fields. And that's what's always made it, in my view, a very exciting field, often a very international space to operate, and people coming in with disciplinary understanding from different places in the world that might be different disciplines. And I think that's a great area to research in, simply because it means that we're all constantly challenged to keep an open mind, to consider that influences can come from various different places. And as we interact more internationally, we also learn that where we are at the interdiscipline, those aren't always the same disciplines. So for, I would say, the work on business historical research in particular, I think as a field, it's been very oriented towards what was happening in economic history, developments in economics, economic theory. And in some places, though by no means everywhere in the world, I think this has shifted in recent years, together with the affiliation of business historians as they were moving into the business school. And here I think there's a whole other group of disciplines present than there were there, I would say, in history departments, in economic departments. Economics might well be part of a business school, but you also have sociologists, you have philosophers, you have people with an interest in marketing, interest in psychology. So business schools are inherently very interdisciplinary spaces. And I think, again, this varies depending on where you are in the world. You're being exposed to lots of other different disciplines. And I think in the last 20 years, this has really given an impetus to all sorts of new research that's really exciting. It's made other people in the business school interested in history, which is great because we get people coming in who may not have initially come in with an interest in history, but realize that looking at some of their questions from a historical perspective is really worthwhile to them. And I think that's the definition of really good interdisciplinary work. So I would say some of the key developments in recent years have really been around the question of which sort of theories do we engage with in our work? Do we perhaps want to think about businesses as organizations that operate in specific ways that are maybe different from economic rationale, that is not just about a group of social actors, but about hierarchies, ways in which management runs certain things, but also the symbolic capital they use? So a lot of decisions and questions might be taken that are not just specific to a space and time, or they're not just explained by economic theory, but they're explained out of this organizational space, out of how organizations are run. And I think in return, what as historians we can give back to these debates is an understanding how over time, what organization thinks they should be doing changes. And we can go back in time to say, back in those days, this would have been the standard of knowledge. Today, it is a different one. And how did we get here? And I think this is really where, as a field, the sort of interdisciplinary and the international side has really sort of led to fascinating research. Esther P.
Thank you, Steffi. And now we can listen to Bernardo. How is your position, Bernardo, about the question and about Steffi put on the table, especially on the theories that we use usually in different spaces? We listen to you, Bernardo, and welcome.
Muchas gracias, Araceli, y muchas gracias al Colegio de la Frontera Norte, a todos los demás colegas que están involucrados en organizar estos eventos. Por supuesto, a la Asociación Mexicana de Historia Económica y a José, que es su presidente, por invitarnos y por darnos este espacio de reflexión. Yo creo que empezar o tener esta apertura, que es lo que se está haciendo en otras partes, es importante. Como Stephanie ya ha mencionado, hay, y para contextualizarlo un poquito más, hay a muy grosso modo muchos de los que estamos haciendo historia de la empresa que supongo que algo podrá hablar un poco más de esto, cae en México dentro de Historia Económica, pero que en otras latitudes y sobre todo en Europa tenemos muy dividido entre lo que es Historia Económica, Historia de la Empresa, Historia de la Contabilidad y por otras razones esto se comparte a cierto punto en Estados Unidos, sobre todo hay grupos muy diferenciados de Historia de la Contabilidad y el otro que está surgiendo como una actividad aparte es Historia o sea, lo que se llama Management History, Historia del Pensamiento en Administración e Historia y lo que no ha habido, o de lo que ha habido relativamente poco, excepto en Historia de la Contabilidad, que es Historia de las prácticas de gestión. Hay manera de ver los que están haciendo historia de la administración, historia del management, están con la tecla pegada en los primeros autores como Taylor y como los Hawthorne Studies y estas cosas, y le están dando ahí vueltas y vueltas y vueltas. Ha habido algunas cosas interesantes, como dos vienen a la mente, que son las contribuciones de los autores de color, es decir, los afroamericanos a la historia del pensamiento. Eso ha tenido mucho éxito, llamó mucho la atención. También el libro se publicó justo cuando estaba saliendo de Black Lives Matter Movement, entonces tuvo todavía más éxito y los autores han hecho un trabajo muy serio. Y el segundo, que es un libro de Marcelo Ruggier sobre los historia del pensamiento económico en América Latina por latinoamericanistas, y ese es un podcast que pueden ver en New Books Network en español, que está ahí. Es un libro interesante y es una cosa que hay una edición especial del Journal of Management History, que es alrededor donde muchas personas se gravitan, que viene específicamente sobre historia del pensamiento en América Latina, y es una vez más los colegas de Colombia, donde tanto en Colombia como en Argentina se hacen cosas muy activas, muy interesantes en todos estos aspectos. Bien, ¿qué otra cosa podemos decir al respecto de esto? Es que en términos de América Latina, o viendo este contexto en términos de América Latina, a mí lo que me parece que hay un interés especial, y por ahí estaba en el público Mario Cerruti, que es alguien que ha contribuido muy activamente a esto, es la historia de las familias y la historia de los grupos empresariales en esta región. Es un tema importante que se puede abordar desde diferentes perspectivas, pero que, como Mario Dávila de la Universidad de los Andes en Colombia ha hecho notar, lo que tenemos que o sea, la forma de poder hacer esto es muchas veces a través de historias orales, aunque el trabajo de Gabriela Recio muestra que hay otras fuentes para poder hacer esto. Entonces, no solamente es un tema de la interdisciplinaridad, es decir, el cómo hablamos y cómo tomamos otro tipo de metodologías y otro tipo de marcos conceptuales, y de eso podemos hablar también aparte, sino de dónde podemos sacar las fuentes para poder articular y poder contribuir a estas discusiones, y dónde están los foros donde podemos ir a empaparnos y a poder tener una conversación con las personas que están haciendo esto, ¿no? Y finalmente, como un tema aparte, que es una cosa que Stephanie también, y tanto Stephanie como Aldo han hecho mucho, ellos pueden hablar más. Digo, ha habido muchas, o sea, contribuciones importantes, por ejemplo, desde la historia de la empresa por ejemplo, al campo de negocios internacionales, de international business, ¿no? Y ahora también se han hecho cosas como, por ejemplo, redes industriales, es decir, y redes de personas, y es una cosa que tú también has estado trabajando, Araceli. Entonces, yo creo que a lo que voy, en resumen, es que hay mucho más que hacer, que estarle dando la vuelta a la tortilla a la época colonial, al porfiriato, al Archivo General de la Nación, ¿no? Eso es lo que, ese es en resumen lo que sí quería contribuir inicialmente.
Thank you very much, Bernardo, for your thoughts. Aldo Musacchio, welcome to this virtual seminar. We are very happy that you stay with us. Interdiscipline in economic history and business history in your work. Territory, international business and history, like Stephanie and Bernardo talk about. But I think the absence in the particular of the Latin American thought and how we think about the interdiscipline in our region, in our big region, and how we can step forward in the thought more powerful. We can hear you.
And I'm going to speak in English so that Stephanie can probably engage more with what I'm going to say, because it's not that it's going to be a debate, but it's maybe more interesting to see how she sees things from her fields. So I am more of an economic historian than a business historian today. And the reason why I want to make the difference is because I think the way Stephanie and Bernardo have presented the field, you can see that we're talking about separate fields. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about the United States. In the United States, the fields today, business and economic history, are very separate. Economic history has tended to go more, to have more of a conversation with the field of economics, and has increasingly relied more on statistical methods of economics. So it looks more like economics than history in a way. And I'm generalizing. Of course, there are historians doing fantastic economic history without statistics, but I'm just generalizing that in general, like if you go to the conferences, it feels more like history, like economics and history. And in a way that has, for instance, pushed me away from business history in the last few years. But what is interesting, before I talk about Mexico, is that in the United States, when business history started, it was less the same field as economic history. Like Alfred Chandler, who I consider the father of business history, was at Harvard, and he would attend the same seminar as Robert Fogel. I mean, and people talk about these seminars and how they were interacting at the beginning, and it was really like a united group. And eventually these things started to separate. And now we are at a point where sometimes the business history seminar at Harvard, it runs exactly at the same time as the economic history seminar. So that you have to, by force, choose which one you attend. And I feel that's very symptomatic of what is happening to the field as a whole. But now let me tell you about me a little bit more so that you understand where I come from. So I am from Mexico, and I was trained as an economist in Mexico, but in my last few years in my undergraduate degree, I was very lucky to be able to attend. Not only I took Carlos Marichal's class at the Colegio de Mexico, but I also attended what was known as the Seminario de Historia de Crédito y Finanzas, something like the seminar of the history of credit and finance. And finance was very broadly understood. So it was public finance as well as we were talking about banks and stock markets and things like that. And there I felt I learned a lot about how economic and business history was perceived as the same field. Like I feel like in Mexico, we talk about economic and business history as if it's the same field. And very early on, and this is in the 1990s, back in the prehistory of the world, you could go to a seminar where you would be talking to people who were approaching the same topic from very different fields. And I felt that everyone wanted to learn from each other. And I mean, and still today, if you go to the meetings of the Mexican Economic History Association, there is this sense that we get a lot from learning from other approaches to history. And so this separation of economic history and business history that we observe, especially in the US, but what I hear from Bernardo is that also in Europe, I feel that it hasn't happened too much in Mexico, and that has made the field very lucky in Mexico. I think I'm going to stop here, but I'll talk more about how this influenced me later on to continue to be more interdisciplinary and all of I'm going to stop here. I don't know if you want me to go ahead there.
Thank you, Aldo. This is a complex landscape proposal from you. And then the second question is, what is the scope of the economic history and business history thinking in different schools and mainstream? I'm asking to Bernardo in first place. Please, Bernardo. Your microphone.
If you could clarify a little bit more, Araceli.
Excuse me?
No. If it's just, I think, o sea, yo creo que lo tocamos un poco, pero si podrías clarificar la pregunta un poco más.
Sí, que este panorama que ustedes han puesto sobre la mesa, que es un complejo panorama entre esta división entre no tanto entre historia económica e historia de los negocios, sino simplemente también desde la economía y la historia, ¿no? Y estos alcances en diferentes espacios de discusión nos plantea un panorama complejo. Entonces, en este sentido, ¿cuál sería el alcance de la historia económica y la historia de los negocios en términos de las diferentes escuelas o los debates actuales, pero sobre todo desde lo que estamos generando en América Latina? ¿Cuál sería tu opinión al respecto?
Yo creo que ahí el reto es encontrar los espacios donde la gente esté ávida a escuchar lo que se puede decir y lo que se puede aprender desde el espacio de la empresa. Son muy pocas las gentes que yo he encontrado que están dispuestos a hacerlo desde el punto de vista, sobre todo, de darte el espacio y apoyarte para hacerlo desde la academia. Sin embargo, creo que hay cierto público para esto y en este respecto hay dos evidencias, dos evidencias domésticas. Uno es una lista, un blog que se llama White Paper, papel blanco, que está sacando artículos, digamos, casi semanales o con un poco más de frecuencia sobre historias empresariales. Ahora, la calidad de la investigación es un poco dudosa y sobre todo no lo hacen de una forma que no sacan sus fuentes, entonces es difícil poder auditar de qué tanto lo que están haciendo. Y llegó otra en estos días por Twitter que se llaman The Company DNA, y así se llama también su handle, que también está tratando de hacer unas cosas, de hacer una historia empresarial cada semana o cada mes, pero no importa. Entonces, se percibe por lo menos desde, yo he tratado de hacer algo en arena pública, entonces hay cierto eco, hay personas que pueden estar interesadas, y como ha sido la experiencia, por ejemplo, de Aldo, como ha sido mi experiencia que pues fue por un encuentro dentro de la carrera, es decir, de la licenciatura, que tuvimos un encuentro con una materia que hablaba sobre historia. Bueno, yo tuve 3, pero eso es otra cosa. Pero es como, pues realmente se siembran las dudas. En España, y con lo que estoy queriendo contrastar, es que en España, por lo menos hasta fechas recientes, la historia económica, la historia regional, la historia de España estaba completamente dentro de los temarios. Ahora se han ido sacando, pero hay muchos colegas que hacen mucha docencia de historia económica, y como en México, historia económica y historia empresarial no se distinguen como diferentes campos. Al mismo tiempo, si tú ves el currículum de la materia de la licenciatura en economía en Wharton, que es, según entiendo, de los más populares, o la carrera más popular, no tienen ya historia económica, no tienen historia del pensamiento, ¿no? Entonces los nuevos economistas y los nuevos administradores, o sea, hasta donde yo sé, hemos sido muy pocos los que hemos peleado y ganado espacios de historia del pensamiento o de historia de la empresa dentro de las carreras de administración. O sea, ha sido más la excepción que la fecha. Entonces, o sea, estoy con muchas palabras para decirte, sí se puede hacer trabajo, pero también tenemos que hacer un esfuerzo por educar al público no especialista, porque es importante para el impacto, para que tenga un impacto más allá de una discusión solamente entre expertos, a mi manera de ver.
Gracias, Bernardo, por tus reflexiones. Aldo, what do you think about the scope of economic history and business history, thinking in different schools and mainstream in Latin America? We're working on it, or why not?
No, I actually think that in Latin America, there's a little bit more, not value or respect for economic and business history in, for instance, in business schools than in the United States. But there are, in some places, there are actual departments to do this. And I feel like researchers in these fields are a little bit more valued, but maybe I'm wrong. In the United States, specifically, since Bernardo was talking about business schools are very strange because the main method of teaching is something called the case method, where you basically study business experiences in the past to draw lessons for the present. So you study, you're going to read about CEMEX. So you read the history of CEMEX, and maybe there is like some decision that some managers had to make, and then you study like the lessons from that. But you are studying, it's basically the method that business schools used to teach. It's historical in nature. So in a way, you could say, business schools value business history a lot. But if you actually look at the business schools in the US, like there are no business history departments in any school. And there are no economic history departments either, which is kind of strange given how important history is supposed to be for teaching business. I mean, there are some exceptions. Stephanie and I were very lucky that we were at Harvard at the same time, and she was in a group that was like basically a business history group, even though the department was not called business history. And I was in an interdisciplinary group where they actually valued economic history a lot. But other than that, there is really no place for economic and business historians as such. And so a lot of us, like Stephanie, maybe Marcelo Buccelli, who a lot of you know, and what we ended up doing is gravitating more to what is called international business, which is a field that also by nature is an interdisciplinary field without business schools. And so a lot of us are probably more closer. Well, I feel like closer to Stephanie because we do international business and we go to the same conferences and, we publish in the same journals of international business than because of the affiliation that we have for business history. That's basically what has happened. So we have had to find a niche of where to go to do business history and economic history in business schools. But I'll let Stephanie maybe give us her point of view.
Yes, of course. Thank you for your thinking about that. Steffi, from schools and mainstream to method through cases of study like Aldo tell us, or teaching more specific in some schools. What is your perspective about that?
Thank you. And it's been very interesting listening to the debates. And I think the really interesting issue at stake here is one that I'm maybe not the best person to talk about, but it's also the situation in Latin America, in Mexico in particular, but also Latin America as the region, of course, a region that has its own infrastructure of journals and publishing, and as such has its own sort of scholarly identity. And I think that's interesting. And I think a lot of the things we are discussing are very Anglo, in the sense of we talk a lot about what's happening in the US. I can bring in the view from the UK a bit more. I would say some of these developments we've been talking about they're quite distinct to Canada, the US, the UK. You also see it happening in France, in Italy, in the Nordic countries. Probably less so, I'd say, in countries like Japan or like South Africa. I would say that's a lot closer maybe to the Latin American experience. The fields are much closer. This tension with, are you in a business school? Are you in economics? Are you in the humanities? These things are generally not as urgent a question. So I think that's where a lot of international diversity comes in. So I think if you're in the Anglophone sphere, the question, and in some other areas, has become whether you're a business school person, you're a humanities person, or you're an economist. And I think that has shaped a lot of the ideas that are being generated in the field. And not all of this is necessarily quite as relevant to maybe Latin American scholars, Mexican scholars. But I think for an international conversation about it, both sides need to be more aware of I think, the kind of intellectual context from which we approach questions. And that's why I think an event like this, and thank you so much for setting up, is really great. I mean, the tensions that Aldo talked about and some of the issues that Bernardo earlier talked about, that there's management history and business history and accounting history, and then there's the issue of how relevant is all of this to non-specialist audiences. I think they're very much framed by this environment in the US, where business schools are really important institutions. History departments have really struggled. So the people who do business in history departments in the US do history of capitalism, to really question the system we're all in. And I think a lot of that, I would expect, has great relevance to Latin American scholars. But if you go to the other side, where the field has moved more towards the social sciences, I think, again, it varies. There are places like Universidad de los Andes, where I think business economic historians are in the business school. They're part of these discussions. They might still also reach out to economic historians, but they're probably a bit more aware of the tensions around, are we part of the business school? What do we teach? What do we contribute? And Aldo made this point around, maybe we are more international business scholars or organization studies scholars than really business historians or economic historians. So people sometimes ask me, do you consider yourself a business historian? Is that okay to call you that? And I'm like, yeah, it's fine. I don't see the problem. Also okay if somebody says I'm an organization studies person. Sure, I also work with those people. So I think, I'm not sure it's really an issue of where our departments are. You know, I think Latin America, often Scandinavia, other places, there's still business or economic history departments where we teach business and economic history. So in my career, I've never taught business history. I've never taught economic history. I've taught international business. I've taught strategy. I've taught international strategy. I've taught managing across borders. I've taught research methods. And every single time I teach history when I teach that. But it's never badged as that. So in many ways, I've sort of decided that everything I teach clearly has a historical dimension. And I can draw on lots of different strands around the world of intellectual capital in terms of how I present that. But yeah, I think if you operate as a business or economic historian in an English-speaking country, your reality and the way you think about knowledge and the way you communicate with non-specialist audiences with your students, you have to think more carefully about what's the relevance of history. And in a way, I think that's very interesting. And that might be a really interesting discussion to have with scholars in Latin America, simply because clearly I imagine there'll be questions, even if you teach business and economic history, why does that matter to Mexicans? How is this important? And I think that's really where we can go beyond the issue of which department do we belong in towards what is really the kind of knowledge that we contribute. So yes, we're all under these pressures, but I think when we're in an international space, I kind of hope we can sometimes maybe also move in and think about our knowledge and these broader connections. And sometimes the fact that we come from lots of different spaces, I kind of hope for us as a field might be a strength for us to think again about why what we research and what we teach is relevant to lots of different people under lots of different labels.
Yeah, very interesting, your thoughts. And this discussion move on to another question that is related to the organizational system and business administration in this new capitalism, or rethinking both organizational systems and business administration in the new capitalisms. And now I question to Aldo, in the debate on these two big areas, what is you thinking about that? You are putting on the table the difference between schools and the big areas to think in business history and the history of business. But how you think, how is thinking in terms of the organizational inner the plans, the big multinationals, and in this kind of global organization of the production, change of production and distribution too.
Thank you, Araceli. I mean, just to basically continue with what Stephanie was saying, I feel like part of what happens when you are in the sort of the Anglo-Saxon countries, and maybe as she said, maybe France, is that you cannot necessarily teach history as such the way we would teach it in Mexico, economic history or business history. You have to teach something else using history. And so I do a lot of that, just to kind of reinforce what Stephanie was saying. I have been very lucky that well, first of all, I was educated in Mexico, where we actually had like a lot of courses that were like that. But when I've gone like Chile, Brazil, Colombia, like there are many of these places where business schools have economic and business historians on staff who teach business and economic history as a subject. And so when I've done teaching in other countries, like you can actually teach exactly that. And it's very nice and comfy. So in a way, what I'm trying to say is like, we're very lucky that in our countries, we still have value for this field as a whole. In business schools, basically what happens is like exactly like we tend to create courses. For instance, if you're going to teach on globalization, you can teach on the history of globalization, so to insert it into the more current debates of globalization. Or if you're going to study like strategy, as Stephanie was saying, strategy is a field that is very contemporary, but that started, I think, to a large extent with Alfred Chandler and with business history, and sort of like, let's learn from history to teach what is going on today. And in terms of, so that's in terms of the teaching. Now, in terms of research, I just wanted to say something a little bit about being interdisciplinary in research is great. I think it's like one of the biggest pleasures in life is to be able to use tools from different fields. In the United States in particular, that can also be a problem when it comes to publishing, because the fields, they want you to follow like very standard practices in the field. And they're not very happy when you're mixing methods from different fields, or when you're not respecting what is. So if I try to publish, for instance, my very first paper published in my life, I did while attending the economic sociology workshop at Stanford University. So I was talking to sociologists. They were using networks, right? Network analysis. And so we did a paper doing network analysis of elites in Mexico and in Brazil. To publish that paper was very, very hard, because it had all the technical tools of network analysis. So it was kind of quantitative. But the topic was very much, a topic that we all work on, especially in Mexico, elites, elite networks and history. But when we sent it to the journals, they were thinking that, no, this paper is too much sociology. So if we send it to an economic history journal, they thought it was sociology. If we send it to like a business history journal, they thought it was too technical. And so we actually had a very hard time publishing. And so I feel that this discussion of interdisciplinarity has consequences not only in teaching, but also in research. And in a way, again, I think we're very lucky in Latin America, and especially in Mexico, that we appreciate more the intersection of fields and learning from other fields than what is happening. Especially in the US, there is hyper-specialization. Everyone wants to, like the fields want to be hyper-specialized, and we're losing the richness of interdisciplinary work. So in a way, this is like we should be very happy in the Mexican Economic History Association that we all appreciate that we're all doing things from a very different perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo. Steffi, what do you think about the Aldo's commenting?
Yeah, really interesting. And in many ways, I agree. And I think it's important to go into that discussion of research. And I completely agree with Aldo that there is something around this understanding of what interdisciplinary research is in the social sciences that makes it absolutely absurd. And maybe it's not even the social sciences. Maybe it's really just business and management. I think the American-based journals are probably the worst, to the point that they all operate on a template model where a certain paragraph needs to say certain things. Otherwise, you do not know what you're doing. There is like no sense. There may be, different ways in which to present an argument, different formats. And I think that's certainly one of the big drawbacks if you work in a business school and you have to get into those journals. Books are not so respected. I'd say the European journals are a little bit more open, but that's a question of degree. And the interesting thing I find is when we have other people who are geographers in the business school. That's something that doesn't tend to happen in America so much. It happens much more, I'd say, in the UK, that we have people who come from different disciplines. They will often speak really poorly about business and management research. They hate the formats. I think it's all very artificial, and these people basically don't know what they're doing. And I just look at them and think like, yeah, but it's not helpful telling our junior faculty that, because frankly, they still need to get into those journals and they have to fit into that template. So I think it creates a strange situation where if you want to publish internationally in these journals, you need to fit into a very specific way of working. I think there are increasingly people trying to break this open, and there are journals that are more open. I also think it sort of is a call to our journals to be more explicit about what makes our research good, and that, a theoretical contribution, which is normally what they say is expected in all the journals, is not the be-all and end-all of work. So I think as a historian, we value things like an empirical contribution, which in business and management would be completely looked down upon. But at business history, I think this week I looked over a new submission, and this was a submission that took issue with the fact that there was a perception that married women weren't working, and looked at a market and looked at the analysis of a market and showed that married women were always working, right? Particularly if the children were no longer small. That's an empirical contribution. It also contributes to our understanding of the past. And it's people make assumptions about the past and put things in the present as if they're incredibly new. Now women come and work in businesses in the 1970s. They were always working. But if we do not know this, then we cannot talk meaningfully about it, and we cannot meaningfully theorize about important things in the world. And I think that's something that, in a lot of business management journals, nobody would understand. And that's a real shame. And I think, I hope we'll be able to move that conversation, but we're small communities. There's a limit. On the other hand, there's still places like in Mexico, as you said, where people are interested in that kind of research. And I think that really helps, because it means that while we're fending sometimes in an incredibly narrow cage, we also realize this doesn't represent the interests of more international communities and of different countries in the world. And business and management is incredibly imperial. It's very much driven from the US. Our knowledge is shaped in imperial ways in business and management from the US. And I think if you're involved in other fields, it's much more obvious how this is happening. So I think it's great that while we're a small community, we're also a very international community. And for me personally, that sort of sometimes keeps me sane when we fend with things like what Aldo was just describing.
Sí, gracias. Bernardo, tú sí que también eres parte de una comunidad internacional, ¿no? Tus estudios han ido de Chile a Estados Unidos, Europa, a Kenia. Trabajas además en los últimos años un sector que, y digo sector porque bueno, es el sector de la banca vista desde el cómo pasamos del cash a las máquinas que te dan dinero, a la tarjeta de crédito. Tienes un temazo que permite visualizar todas estas aristas y claro, los sistemas organizacionales y el management, pues más que situado desde tu trabajo, ¿cómo ubicas justamente estos debates internacionales? Y no toques lo de los journals porque esa es la última parte, o sea, cómo estamos ahí, eso es para la última, pero desde tu perspectiva, ¿no? ¿Cómo entiendes estos sistemas organizacionales cada vez más complejos, globalizados, cadenas de distribución, de comercialización, pero sistemas además en términos de la banca, altamente globalizados, ¿no? Que nos permiten justamente situar lo que se ha debatido aquí. O sea, sin duda tu tema permite entender también mucho la interdisciplina, pero ¿cómo lo has hecho tú? ¿Y cómo lo entiendes tú?
Sí, gracias Araceli el tomatazo inmerecido. Y bueno, no podemos, bueno, si quieres pasar a lo del journal y a la interdisciplinaridad, que es el eje de la plática en la siguiente pregunta, pero yo creo que en ese sentido tanto Aldo como Stephanie han tocado un par de puntos esenciales que, bueno, a reserva de retomarlos o para que no se me olvide, nada más les digo que es una cosa que es lo que te piden y otra cosa que es lo que puedes hacer, o sea, que es lo que te dan, ¿no? Pero bueno, llegamos a eso en la próxima. ¿Cómo lo entiendes? Pues es que depende. O sea, yo creo que tanto la historia de la empresa como la historia económica han hecho contribuciones muy importantes para entender la globalización, los regímenes que articulan esa globalización, como el capitalismo, que es una cosa que también se ha hecho, y pues es, ¿cómo lo entiendo yo? Pues estar abiertos a tener una conversación con colegas que están en otras disciplinas o en otras posiciones conceptuales y estar listos a escuchar qué es lo que tienen, qué es lo que están diciendo y aprender de eso. Y puedo dar ejemplos de primera mano en diferentes, tanto en el tiempo, o sea, en el tiempo pasado, mediano e inmediato. Y pues yo empecé trabajando con las gentes que hacen historia de la contabilidad, he trabajado mucho con las personas que hacen, que es un trabajo primordialmente empírico, porque no hay realmente una teoría de la contabilidad o un marco teórico de la contabilidad. Entonces ellos están tomando tanto de economía como un trabajo muy, muy empírico, como trabajos más sociológicos o incluso de critical management como Foucault o como Bourdieu o como todas esas gentes. Entonces puede ser un tema o un área rica. Lo mismo pasa con las gentes que hacen historia de la computación y de la tecnología, o sea, que son un subset de la historia de la tecnología, que ellos hacen o se llaman ahora Social Studies of Technology. Y pues ahí tienes a Latour, tienes bueno, el debate que ha habido en estos días sobre lo que se hace Harvard, pero no es tanto teórico como ya a nivel de personal y cómo también tiene esta dinámica personal y de equipos de trabajo, pero en fin, también ellos tienen un interés o algunos de ellos tienen un interés por no solamente ver los cambios tecnológicos, sino también los cambios sociales, y dentro de estos cambios sociales, cómo afectan a las empresas que son usuarias de estos métodos, y entrar y tener conversaciones con gente, o sea, ahí en ese espacio como Tom Haig o como Jim Cortada, que es una gente que ha hecho mucho trabajo a lo largo de los años combinando siendo consultor y siendo historiador, y él trabajó con Chandler y siempre ha tenido pues una facilidad de pluma que ya quisiéramos muchos, o el mismo Martin Campbell Kelly, que es una gente que ha hecho mucho trabajo ahí, que siempre se ha sentido historiador económico, historiador empresarial e historiador de la computación, y eso lo puso en su último libro que se llama Cellular, ¿no? Y él le llama una historia económica, empresarial y de la tecnología, de la tecnología móvil, u otras gentes como los antropólogos económicos que se llaman, ellos hacen cosas de pagos, los sociólogos que siguen la línea de Viviana Seltzer también, y justamente ayer estaba hablando con lo que va a ser para los economistas más conservadores, ortodoxos, pues con gente que está haciendo el modern monetary theory, ¿no? Que es para una herejía para ellos, pero sin embargo que gente que ha adoptado este enfoque conceptual en espacios de historia, de economía política, están haciendo están haciendo contribuciones sobre la historia del dinero muy interesantes, ¿no? En el último año han sacado 3 libros diferentes o 4, cada uno con una perspectiva muy diferente de qué es el dinero, de cómo se construye el dinero, de cómo se construyen los pagos, y esto, una de las cosas que estábamos comentando precisamente ayer es que la gente se pone barreras mentales y no quiere oír lo que están diciendo. Dice, no, es Modern Monetary Theory, son unos herejes y no quiero saber nada más de eso. A ver, espérate. O sea, ¿por qué vienen? O sea, ¿qué es lo que les está permitiendo? Y es que, ¿qué es lo que les está permitiendo poder entrar a estas discusiones mucho más ricas? No les tienes que comprar todo el boleto. O sea, a lo mejor es replicando lo que hacemos como trabajo diario, que es un mosaico, ¿no? Porque a veces no podemos reconstruir la realidad completa, sino a través de mosaicos, ser también un poco abiertos a decir, bueno, ¿qué es lo que puedes aprender de estas diferentes cosas y dónde te vas a centrar tú? Y eso es una cosa que, con respecto a lo que decían, yo creo que ciertamente Aldo, ciertamente Aldo, es que al menos en el Reino Unido, eso hasta épocas más o menos recientes, Steffi podrá estar o no de acuerdo, pero una cosa que se permitía, ciertamente cuando yo me formé y cuando yo empecé a trabajar, podías tener esta mucho más apertura, mucho más bandwidth a diferentes metodologías y a diferentes concepciones. También puede haber temas ahí contextuales, y es porque las escuelas de negocio estaban creciendo y lo que necesitaban era un cuerpo caliente, hablante, enfrente de las pompas que estaban en los asientos, y les daba igual de qué les hablaras mientras se cumpliera el currículo. Y entonces por eso había mucho más amplitud. En la medida que el número de alumnos ha ido reduciéndose, pues yo he percibido que esa flexibilidad se ha ido reduciendo hasta cierto punto, y eso nos ha obligado al mismo tiempo a tener una conversación en términos en los cuales los colegas que están alrededor de nosotros entiendan. Y para eso es que, o lo puedes ver en que diferentes personas, Stephanie incluido, ¿no? Han escrito cómo es que es la metodología en historia de la empresa, cómo es que podemos tener elementos conceptuales, o que incorporamos o no elementos conceptuales. Y acaba de hablar ella brevemente de eso, pero eso es en parte, y llevamos, pues no sé si 10 años con esto. Por ejemplo, el trabajo de Marcelo Buccelli y Dan Wadhanian, que se llama el libro Organizations in Time, trata de hacer también este puente para explicar y tener una relación y una conversación y no ser los raros del equipo, ¿no? Y eso es no solamente encontrar, seguir haciendo lo que estamos haciendo, pero también decirles a los otros, estamos abiertos a tener esta conversación y no nos vamos a cerrar, y los que quieran entrar, pueden entrarle, pero pues estas son las reglas de lo que nosotros estamos trabajando, de la misma forma que nosotros respetamos las reglas de lo que ustedes están haciendo, ¿no?
Gracias, Bernardo, porque justamente nos permites entrar a la última pregunta, al último round, y empezaremos ahí con Steffi. Steffi, from your publications and projects, how you have introduced the interdisciplinary debate, and how you doing to be more visible possible in different journals, the discussion about your thinking, the business history and economic history, organizational systems. What is the route that you have planned for your work?
Okay, thank you. And I'm trying to refer back a little bit to what Bernardo said. I must admit, the point around mosaic completely lost me. I couldn't follow that, but I got the bit about greater bandwidth, methodological innovations, interdisciplinary research, and I think what I understood was UK in the business schools a little bit more open to a greater diversity of research. That I completely agree with. I think that has opened up real opportunities for us in terms of interdisciplinarity, and I think that goes in two ways. One way is obviously to think about ourselves as social scientists, regardless of whether we're economic or business historians or both. We are also social scientists, and we want to communicate with other social scientists. That does mean, to some extent, speaking their language. But I think not speaking their language without losing our own language, that would be a problem. So a lot of the work I've been doing has been around methods and methodology and theoretical epistemological assumptions that make us historical and that gives us something that we can tell other people about that will add to their knowledge and their skill base. So at the moment, we're just finishing off an edited volume, a handbook of historical methods in management, which we're super excited about. We've really taken care to make sure that this opens up. We have accounting historians in there. We have management historians in there. We have people in there talking about indigenous thinking about history. We've got somebody looking at what does history look like in an Indian context. But there's always more to be done. But we were really trying to address management scholars with that and really open up this space of saying, you know, if history is a social science, here are the many ways in which you can do history. And that probably goes beyond what we're necessarily comfortable with, maybe in business and economic history, because I think that's part of probably what we then also need to accept, that other people will come in with new ideas, but that also refreshes our own practice. And I think this handbook, what was really great about it was that I didn't go and flog it to any publishers. I had a publisher approach me and say, look, we want to do a handbook of historical methods in management. I thought, wow, that's great. They actually know we exist. I mean, you know, sad to have to say this, but, you know, obviously in the very busy marketplace of ideas that is the business school, that's great. And I think it's an opening for everybody to bring in more ideas. I think we could have had more quantitative stuff. We haven't got anything on quantitative methods because that disjoint with economic history. And I think, again, do we want to maintain this? There are plenty of places around the world where that's not an issue. So I think that's an area we could do more. I'm co-editing a special issue in GIPS, where they were also really keen on historical methods. That's following on from many other special issues. So I think we're really sort of making our presence felt, and that's really important. On the other hand, I think it also means our journals, we need to be clearer. What do other people need to do to publish history with us? So in business history, we're trying to be more explicit. And we have people who are marketing scholars, but they do really exciting work about the history of consumption. So we've published some pieces of work by them. And I think that, again, requires us to be clear about what do we expect when we say historical. And we get an awful lot of stuff that really isn't historical. But I think that sort of exchange goes both ways. And this is really, I think, the space where I've tried to do a lot of work. I've done quite a lot of theoretical, methodological work. What I'd really love to do next, because you asked me about my plans, is go back to some of my historical research and look at it again from the sort of this new space, the space in between the disciplines, and look at whether that research could also speak to colleagues in management. And that's kind of where I hope we can get to as an international group of scholars. Lots of different histories for lots of different audiences.
Thank you, Steffi. Bernardo, no basta solamente escribir en inglés, hay que hacer más y ser más creativos. Hay que imaginar un mundo distinto de como lo hemos venido haciendo hoy. Cuéntanos, ahora sí, publicaciones, tipos, no solo journals. ¿Qué más? Tu micro.
Perdón, pensé que estaba al revés. Sí, era repetir lo que mencionaba Aldo y Stephanie, que habiendo evaluado una serie de propuestas de investigación, siempre te piden o buscan que haya esta interdisciplinaridad, pero no siempre encuentras esos espacios. Y tú mencionabas, por ejemplo, el trabajo que he hecho en términos de pagos, y pues las gentes que hacen pagos interesa mucho, pero es muy, o sea, están encontrando que es muy difícil poder posicionar tanto todo tipo de trabajos que hablen sobre pagos, porque unos los ven como finanzas, otros los ven como economía, y estoy repitiendo lo que dijo Aldo y te mandan de un lado para otro, pero pues cosas que hacer hay mucho, no solamente desde historia de la empresa, sino de estudiar la misma realidad. No recuerdo, por ejemplo, y puede ser por falta de conocimiento, a nadie que haya trabajado, bueno, desde repetir el trabajo que se ha hecho sobre la financialización de la economía y cómo fue que se creó, por ejemplo, las casas de bolsas y cómo crece el mercado accionario en México. Aldo ha hecho trabajo en Brasil, pero a principios de siglo, pero por ejemplo de los 60s a los 80s, ¿cómo pasas de los agentes de bolsa que eran individuos a las casas de bolsas, al boom de los 80s? Eso es por una parte. U otras cosas que son más cerca de lo que estamos haciendo. Mario y tú han hecho mucho trabajo sobre grandes empresas, Carlos ha hecho trabajo sobre grandes bancos, pero a lo que quería ir es que nadie ha hablado sobre los microempresarios desde el punto de vista de historia de la empresa. O sea, ¿cómo es, por ejemplo, que puedes ver hoy en día en el centro de la Ciudad de México organillos que se hicieron a principios del siglo XX y que siguen trabajando y que la gente sigue ganándose la vida con eso? Puedes decir que son estrictamente mendigos, pero son mendigos organizados porque hay un sindicato de organilleros, han incorporado mujeres, incorporan elementos contextuales como se pintan de panda entonces, ¿cómo trabajas con eso? Y son del tipo de cosas que la interdisciplinaridad te puede permitir rescatar los elementos, no sé, de sociológicos o gente que sepa hacer etnografía de a de veras, poderlos trabajar, porque hay que tener una sensibilidad de cómo tratar con ellos para que te cuenten su historia, porque son bien microempresarios y que tienen todo este tema y pues o el punto de la tecnología por ahí había un artículo que parece ser que es una señora la que se los repara, ¿no? ¿Cómo aprendió eso? ¿De dónde saca las piezas? Porque ya no son piezas que se hagan en Alemania, se tienen que haber hecho aquí desde hace mucho tiempo. Entonces, hay esta interdisciplinaridad en América Latina y en México específicamente. Yo creo que se puede llevar a enriquecer no solamente el contexto internacional, sino conocer mejor lo que es nuestra realidad empresarial a diferentes niveles y no solamente quedarnos en los aspectos más macro, ¿no?
Y gracias, Bernardo, porque creo que has puesto el dedo en la llaga, no solamente citando las ausencias, sino las oportunidades también de la interdisciplina y algo que se mencionó a lo largo de esta discusión, también la tecnología. Y pues yo creo que tenemos ese reto de pensar no solamente la ttecnología de punta, el blockchain, la inteligencia artificial, sino esta tecnología del día a día, ¿no? Y estas micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas que al menos en México llegan a 5 millones y que se mantienen. Y aunque pasó la pandemia y teníamos una perspectiva de crecimiento bastante adversa en números, pues la realidad es que sigue funcionando la economía y siguen estando esas micro, pequeñas y medianas empresas ahí latentes. Pero pues no queremos dejar de escuchar a Aldo para que hagamos este cierre. Y si me lo permiten, invitar después de que hable Aldo a Carlos Marichal, por si quiere hacer algún comentario, para que después cada uno cierre con una frase o una idea sobre pues lo que ha sido esta discusión. Entonces, si les parece, Aldo, te escuchamos.
Well, I wanted to start by just saying that Stephanie and Marcelo Buccelli and other friends have been doing an amazing job at trying to kind of open up spaces for interdisciplinary history in journals. I used to try to do more, so by doing basically applying so that journals that usually don't publish history suddenly have special issues where it's allowed to be an interdisciplinary sort of economic or business historian. It's great. I've tried it in other journals before. The problem is getting a lot. The problem is that the people who let you do that sometimes feel like, oh, I'm not going to read this special issue because this is a history issue, rather than learning from the history issue. But I feel like Stephanie and Marcelo are really making inroads in opening up the field for others to publish in. Then I wanted to talk about what Bernardo is saying, sort of like there are topics that are very interesting, like for instance, like microhistories and things like that. And how can we make them so that they talk to people in others? The topic that came to mind is a topic that I didn't know anything about. I learned with a seminar that Carlos Marichal led in the 90s, which was using notarial records, that are notarias, to do history of business, right? Basically do business history using the notaries. That topic has now has like, there is this whole group of economists who are now very interested in this. Obviously, so Naomi Lamoureux in Yale, Tim Guinan, who's also at Yale University, Ron Harris in the University of Tel Aviv, and Jean-Laurent Rosenthal, who's in Caltech, like they all have now work with notarial records. The problem is, I actually was going to say is, it's moving now too much into economics, that topic. And so now the papers are using all these big data techniques to, work with all the notarial records, and it's becoming very sophisticated, and it's sort of like, again, starting to lose the connection with historical research. And I recently just reviewed a paper that uses notarial records in Egypt, like the most amazing paper I've seen, where they basically learn of all the work that other people have done in notarial records in other countries. And then they went to Egypt and they basically collected all the notary records, and they can tell you like about the history of corporations and partnerships and all sorts of what we would call sociedades mercantiles, like in Egypt for like a very long period of time. Anyway, so the final point was that the other way in which we can actually promote more interdisciplinary history is to do a lot of work for journals. It's very costly because it's our time, right? I spend a lot of time reviewing papers for journals, and I try to do that with many different journals from many different fields. So I can be in the editorial board of Stephanie was just messaging me about this, of like a strategy journal, but at the same time in like the financial history review or the Journal of Economic History or something like that. But it requires a lot of time. It's a big time commitment, but that's the way to actually opening up a lot of these places that tend to be very closed, opening them up to researchers from many different places in the world and using many different methodologies. Finally, the other point I wanted to say, and this is my last point, is that I feel the other strategy is to do meetings like this, especially with doctoral students around the world. I just did one yesterday in Brazil, very similar, where we had experts from different countries talking to young researchers about how we do research in other parts of the world and all of that, but basically communicate with the people who are starting their research trajectory, what it takes to have these conversations, as Bernardo said, like how do you have a conversation with someone who's not in your field, but who may actually want to learn a lot from you. And I feel this is a great thing to do, like more conversations like this, and make sure that young people see, like, the opportunities and the challenges. Thank you.
Thank you, Aldo. And now we want to listen to one of our special guests, if he wants, of course. Please, Carlos Marichal, how you think about the discussion today? It's for us a pleasure that you stay with us today.
Well, Araceli, it's all very interesting. The webinars are interesting. This one is particularly so with different perspectives and different people thinking about, as far as I see it, the problems of dealing with business history and international business history. But this is something that that interests me. But I think that it's also useful to have a dialogue that involves other groups. For instance, history of technology, that's very understudied in Latin America. And there are now some specialists. There are not many, but there are some. I think that's a field that has to be developed more.
Yes.
Then there is the history of commodities. And that is a big field. There are a lot of people also involved. That's related to economic history and to business history in some ways. Depends on the case. My field that I'm most interested now in is history of banking history and financial history. But I find it frustrating often to have discussions with people in outside of Latin America, but also inside. When we are dealing with economists, they're not interested in financial history. After the crisis of 2008, they did not incorporate courses on financial history except on very limited basis. For instance, people like Bordeaux and Eichengreen could do it because at their universities they have the weight to do that. But in general, the economists are still dealing with their manuals and are not particularly interested in financial history. It's surprising. On the other hand, people who are interested in financial history have a huge audience, basically people in central banks. There are now something like 500,000 employees of central banks in the world. And there are an enormous number who are interested in financial history. That has changed dramatically over the last 10 or 15 years. Then there's the European Association of Banking History, which has lots of people involved and engaged. And I find that's an interesting area. So I say that the diversity of topics and subjects that one can become interested in is extraordinary. Many of these areas don't have a specific journal, but some do. Technology does, no? And transport and communications has one, no? Commodities, there are many places where people publish, and it's no big problem. Those subjects are more interesting for Latin American researchers generally than strictly business history. There is a problem convincing students and professors that business history is the way to go. When we talk about Historia Empresarial, that sounds better, no? But then there's also the problem of the weakness of business schools in Latin America in general. There are not that many. And so I think that in the future, there should be an attempt made to establish more links with the professors who do work in the business history departments or business departments of business schools. This would be very general observations. I think that this type of discussion can suggest ways to contact other people who are connected, who are not necessarily define themselves as business historians. And there are a lot in Latin America. In terms of economic historians, I remember a number of years ago, the total was something like 1,400. And in the US, there were like 880 economic historians. So in Latin America, there are a huge number of people working in economic history. different levels of capacity and of publication, but it's a very large public, and there, as we saw in the meeting in April with the Business History Conference, people become interested, but you have to establish the conversation, and that Business History Conference was one of the first times that the dialogue really, it seemed to me, began to work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. I want to read a comment come from YouTube, and then you close this seminar. Well, hi, I am Mexican scholar working around East African banking history. From my experience, I really believe that Mexico and Latin American business historians should work more and our relations with the rest of scholars from the global south in order to increase the interest in the subjects and to have knowledge and access to private and public archives, particularly because there are great topics with potential. For example, an access to private and public archives, particularly because there are great topics with potential. For example, the internationalization of business from underdeveloped economies to other underdeveloped economies and others. Cracking almost a little the imperialism from USA in those topics, as Steffi said, Christian Velasco. This is one of the people listened this seminar today. Right now, I would like to listen the final thought, not the final in the sense, total sense. For this seminar, I'm saying we are very happy to stay with you today. Please, in order to the first intervention, Steffi, your final reflections about this seminar, about your thinking, or whatever you want.
Okay, thank you. Always dangerous to give me a blank sheet of paper, but maybe to just comment on Christian Velasco's comment. Obviously, he published with Business History, where I'm editor-in-chief. It was a great piece. I think he's absolutely right. I think some of the issues we face, often around archives, and, I've worked on African business history myself, but often through Western archives, because of accessibility issues, data issues. And one of the things I'm personally quite passionate about, and where I think this interdisciplinary opening is a great opportunity for the field, is to bring in other forms of history like oral history, and to simply consider that if we want to write more of the history of the global South, of South-South history, we may have to go outside our comfort zone and entertain different methods. Oral history is quite underdeveloped in business history. It's often very much focused on the managers. And I think there are different ways we can do research. The field I'm interested in African business history. I think that's very much necessary. But I think that comes with new challenges. And that's why, maybe to end on, this is why an event like this is so important, that we can all talk about the things that interest us as a group, even though we come from different spaces with different assumptions. And hopefully we will be doing more of this. And as a result, we have more interesting and exciting research. So thank you very much for the invitation and for setting up this great event. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Steffi. We are very happy with you. Bernardo, tus pensamientos finales para este espacio de intercambio.
Bueno, pues
que no finales del todo.
Muchas gracias, Araceli. Sí, yo creo que lo que hemos dicho todos es que hay muchas cosas por hacer, tienen sus retos, enfatizar lo que habíamos mencionado, sobre todo el tema de la historia oral, pero también el buscar otras alternativas o reimaginarnos el área en una forma creativa que tenga un diálogo con discusiones internacionales. Es decir, lo fácil es repetir o replicar lo que se ha hecho fuera, el pensar qué es lo que nos está discutiendo, qué es importante para nosotros, pero luego el ejemplo de los organilleros, pero luego cómo ponerlo para que sea interesante a otros es donde está el reto, pero sí se puede hacer. Así que sí se puede, ¿no?
Sí se puede. No, gracias, Bernardo. Y yo no quiero dejar pasar el hecho de que este gran panel, Diana dijo que había sido culpa mía, pero es una culpa compartida, porque Bernardo fue quien me puso en contacto con Steffi, y Steffi conoce a Aldo, y yo le dije a Aldo, y al final creo que es parte de lo que nos corresponde, ¿no? Ampliar nuestras redes con los amigos de siempre y crear otros espacios de colaboración y de discusión y de comparación. Creo que es el resultado de ello, ¿no? Y gracias, Bernardo, por haber hecho posible que contactara a Steffi. Aldo, ¿quieres hacer el gran cierre de los panelistas del día de hoy?
Yeah, of course. Bueno, thank you very much for the invitation, Araceli. It's really a wonderful conversation. It's making me think a lot about how I do history and maybe what I shouldn't continue doing. But I was going to say that in a way, this panel, we have three people who want to talk to sort of the imperial academic powers. So it may not be the best panel to talk about how to rebel against the empire because we're not part of the resistance. But I would say that for me, for instance, an effort that I applaud a lot is like things like CLADE, like organizations that are really South-South, where the agendas are really South-South and not determined by what is trendy in the United States or Europe. I oftentimes feel myself a little bit far from some of what is happening in these meetings, but I feel like that's really the way to talk. So in the 90s, I did economic and business history in Mexico, and then in the 2000s, I did it in Brazil. And I honestly was very disappointed that there was no conversation. But now, like thanks to these efforts that many of you are a part of, like there's a lot more conversation between economic historians in South America and Mexico than between, people in the US and maybe people in South America. And I actually love that. And there are like fantastic efforts. I'm trying to remember the names of all the seminars online that are organized in Latin America, for instance, that are only about Latin America. And those efforts for me are like really the way to develop an agenda that is not only talking to the imperial superpowers. The problem when you go north is that the incentives that we have, like to get sort of like promoted in our universities or to move to another university, we need to publish in certain journals that are like, part of this system. So we are kind of like, don't expect the resistance to come from us because we are totally co-opted in the system here. The resistance has to come from you, and you guys have to come up with the agendas that are relevant for the South-South. That would be my final lesson. And I want to learn, what agendas come out of those efforts. Thanks.
Excelente, no, pues muchas gracias y de verdad que ha sido un placer escucharlos a todos, a todas. Sigamos con las agendas, de verdad que a mí me ha tocado ser parte de esas agendas y Bernardo no me dejará mentir, nuestra grata coincidencia ya en varios proyectos y con varios de ustedes, creo que tenemos que hacer esas ondas expansivas para unir a esos espacios que parecen tan alejados. Yo le doy la palabra a Reinaldo para que clausure nuestro segundo seminario de reflexiones desde una colaboración entre la Asociación Mexicana de Historia Económica y la Asociación de Historia Económica del Norte de México. Por favor, Reinaldo, para poder clausurar y tomarnos la foto de grupo, ¿no?
Sí, gracias, Araceli, y otra vez gracias a nuestros invitados, Stephanie, Aldo, Bernardo, por sus reflexiones muy interesantes todas sobre historia e interdisciplina. Creo que se han expuesto ideas muy valiosas. Se empezó hablando de las fronteras entre historia económica, historia de negocios o historia de empresa. Bernardo decía que, es importante rescatar teorías y métodos, pero también la cuestión de las fuentes fue algo que se apuntó en un inicio. Aldo complicaba un poco más la situación porque decía que es muy bonita la interdisciplina, pero al momento de conciliar interdisciplina e hiperespecialización, entonces empieza a haber ahí ciertas fricciones. Y bueno, Stephanie también nos ayudó mucho hablando de sus experiencias con publicaciones en algunas revistas que luego en Estados Unidos particularmente suelen tener formatos muy rígidos, pero bueno, hay otras opciones que ya se comentaron acá. Y quisiera finalizar también con lo que cerraba Aldo en su última intervención, que era pues, la importancia de estas discusiones, de llevarlas a otros espacios, con estudiantes doctorales, por ejemplo, pero también el doctor Marichal agregaba abrirla a otros grupos o subgrupos, ¿no? Habla por ahí historia de las finanzas, pero también de la tecnología. Yo he insistido también en abrir el diálogo entre historia económica e historia ambiental. Entonces, en fin, creo que hay muchas cosas que van a salir de aquí y por eso les reiteramos el agradecimiento, porque creo que nos van a permitir seguir reflexionando y nutrir discusiones de historia económica que nunca están de más. Entonces, finalmente les recordamos que esto es un esfuerzo conjunto entre la Asociación Mexicana de Historia Económica y la Asociación de Historia Económica del Norte de México. Hemos tenido 2 seminarios este año con los cuales quedamos bastante contentos y les invitamos a seguirnos el próximo año esperamos otra vez eventos igual de interesantes, así que les pedimos que sigan atentos a nuestra agenda y les agradecemos a todos los participantes y a los asistentes por habernos acompañado. Entonces, hasta luego, muchas gracias. Fue un gusto compartir esta mesa.
Pues nos cortan transmisión, ¿verdad, Fabián? Para que no salga el after.